much. I am delighted to be here to chat a little bit about a couple things. Number one, for those of you in the room who don't know much about the Toronto Financial Services Alliance, to tell you who we are, what we do in the financial sector. And number two, to provide a bit of an overview of where we stack up here in Canada and in Toronto too, from a fintech ecosystem perspective as we look at other big financial centers around the world. So first of all, just quickly, as was mentioned, we are a public-private partnership between the big financial institutions, the financial sector, and the three levels of government. And the organization was put together to promote the Toronto financial services industry globally, but also to think about what are the initiatives we need to think about collectively between both the private sector and the public sector that are going to drive growth and competitiveness. And so obviously FinTech is something we think about every day, and innovation within the financial sector. So the driving leadership behind the Toronto Financial Services Alliance is 15 CEOs in the financial sector, and also the mayor, the premier, and the two ministers of finance at the provincial and federal level. But we really do represent a very broad spectrum of the ecosystem. So academia, the different industry associations, all of those professionals who are a part of the ecosystem in the financial sector. So to move into FinTech specifically, and how do we stack up in Canada and what's going on, clearly every part of our industry is changing. We all know that. I'm sure you've been talking about that for the last day and a half. Not just payments, but every element of the industry is changing with innovation. And there's always this dialogue around who's going to win. Is it the big FinTech? Is it the incumbents? And how does it all pan out? And I think that dialogue has changed actually quite dramatically, I think, over the last year or two, particularly in Canada. I think everyone's recognizing that this actually is going to be a collaboration between the fintechs and the larger incumbents, and there's going to be partnerships that are forming and will continue to form between the two. But there's no doubt that the pace of innovation and change has been driven by the fintechs, certainly. And they've elevated what customers are expecting today. And so those two things certainly have been driving real change in the industry. I think we haven't seen the infrastructure change dramatically from what perhaps was thought in the beginning. It's not to say it won't in the future. But right now we've seen the fintechs more impacting pieces, improving pieces of the infrastructure. So it remains to be seen how that pace will continue. There's no doubt it's going to be quick. It's going to be faster than is comfortable for big incumbents, and not fast enough for the fintechs, no doubt. I think where we've seen in jurisdictions around the world where we've seen it, the scale and the impact of the fintechs really be more significant is where we didn't have strong incumbents who were doing a pretty good job serving the market. So if we think about WeChat in China and how that's really changing things. And as we think about just generally fintech adoption, so you can see from this slide here that fintech adoption in Canada is actually, we've been a bit of a slow starter. It's about 18% relative to the average of 13% globally. And clearly we've seen markets like China and India at much higher adoption rates, close to 70%, 50%. But the UK as well is much higher at 42%. So that's not to say that I don't think that this graph is going to change in the years to come. I think it's going to change, and I think it will change relatively quickly in terms of fintech adoption here in Canada. I wanted to take a look too at investment. So what is driving some of that fintech adoption and that innovation in different financial centers? So if we look globally, really the rate of investment, and this is venture capital funding, has increased dramatically. So 5 years ago, it would have been about $3.5 billion total investment. Today, or last year, that number is about $17 billion. So significant investment. No surprise, United States at the top there with $7 billion. United Kingdom and China, significant deal flow as well there. Canada is 7th on this particular metric in terms of venture capital. So relative to our size, at about $440 million into the industry, much smaller, obviously, than the big players I just mentioned. But we have had significant investment here in Canada, too, on the fintech front. I'll just talk really briefly about a couple of areas that we're focused on here in the financial sector, clearly. AI, no surprise to anyone in the room here. I'm sure it's been talked about a lot at the conference already. I do think that this is an opportunity for Toronto, for Canada, for our sector, to really develop a hub of excellence here. And we're already starting to see that happen. And it's being recognized as we're seeing folks from other countries, companies from other countries come in and set up hubs here around artificial intelligence. I think the other one, no doubt, that we're all thinking about is cybersecurity. And we actually have had the fourth most investment in cybersecurity in Canada relative to other countries around the world, about $250 million. We'll continue to see that happen. I think there's some really exciting things happening in Canada. For instance, the University of Waterloo. If you think about the Institute for Quantum Computing, and what's happening there around, what does cybersecurity look like when we get to the land of quantum computing. So I think these two areas in particular, ones where we really want to develop some hubs of expertise here in Toronto and in Canada. I did want to mention a study that we did about a year ago, and this was with Accenture, and we tried to take a look at the fintech ecosystem here in Toronto, and how does it stack up? How are we doing relative to others? So we came in around middle of the pack. I wish I could tell you we were at the top of the charts here. This really looked at a bunch of different things: funding, openness, general innovation, ecosystem, talent for each particular financial center. So we were in and around Hong Kong and Berlin on those particular metrics. Certainly we saw New York and Silicon Valley with the depth of their market, the maturity of their markets, the funding there at the top in terms of innovation, fintech ecosystems there. And interestingly as well, you see the UK and Singapore up higher in a ranking than Canada. And that really is because we've seen there a much broader national strategy around what should we be doing to drive innovation in the financial sector, what do we need to do from a regulatory perspective, how can government drive that strategy, how can it coordinate it more. Certainly in Canada, as everyone knows here, when we think about our regulators, there's no mandate for competitiveness in their mandate. It's not about that here. I think we've seen that mandate for competitiveness get weaved in a little bit more in other financial centers. So that's where we stack up today. In terms of Toronto on that particular front. I won't spend too much time in regulatory here, everyone will fall asleep, but you can't really talk about fintech without talking about regulation. Not going to go through who all these folks are on this chart. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of regulators in Canada, and that makes things very complicated for all of us in the industry. I know there's been talk, I think, at other panels already around open banking and what's happening in other jurisdictions on that front. I've talked a bit about different regulatory regimes and perspectives in Singapore and UK, Australia arguably as well on that front. So I think certainly something that TFSA has been advocating for is for us to think in Canada about what is that national strategy, who is that body that's going to drive a more coordinated approach here so that we're creating an environment that fosters competition and fosters innovation in the financial sector. We've seen lots of reports out there around this, so people are aware of the issue. It's just how are we going to get there? I think the Competition Bureau was one of the more recent studies around this. I won't go through all the recommendations, but really it was around creating principles-based regulation that doesn't need to be rewritten every time we have a new technology out there, and making sure it fosters collaboration and innovation with things like regulatory sandbox and things like that, ways to scale up. So in terms of Toronto, I'll just chat very briefly about Toronto. We stack up pretty well in terms of financial center. On the left there, you'll see we're the second largest financial center in North America, and I'm sad to say that not a lot of people know that when you go outside of Canada. We're seventh largest globally. And the thing that's even lesser known is Toronto and the region around it has the second largest ICT cluster in North America as well. So that's pretty powerful. We have a huge advantage with that, to be able to have the technology sector so close to the financial sector, and a real opportunity to drive some real innovation in the system. Another stat that just came out recently is the Toronto-Waterloo corridor boasts the second highest density of technology startups. So I think we need to start taking advantage of that in the financial sector, seeing that great pool of talent in the tech sector alongside the financial sector as a huge advantage for us here, and hopefully to bring us up in those rankings in the international charts in terms of our prominence as a financial center globally. I did want to talk about one last thing before I turn over the stage to our other speakers here. in the effort to drive this ecosystem around fintech in Toronto and in Ontario, there was an announcement recently that TFSA is going to be leading a fintech accelerator office, and we'll be opening the doors in the fall on that one. It's not an accelerator in the sense of a Mars or a Communitech or one of those. It's more of a hub for information, for help navigating regulatory environments, for help with funding, where should different fintechs go to get the information and the help and the resources that they need. So I think this is an important step in trying to create some coordination and hub around the path forward. Clearly, we'll be doing a lot of work around policy and regulatory work and advocating on behalf of things that move the sector forward. And certainly we'll want to create as well, some thought leadership within that office. So I think that's an important step here. I think as we, think about the path forward, having some coordination is critical within Canada, and I hope to see some of that coordination that we've seen in other jurisdictions happen here in Canada in terms of our fintech strategy and just fostering a great innovation ecosystem alongside our large financial incumbents. So thank you very much for having me here today. I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker.